I'm having a bit of a slower year, but I'm about 50 films in, and I finally have a new number one film of the year. That movie is called Obsession. It just got released this past weekend from Focus Features and most surprisingly, Blumhouse. But it is in theaters right now. I'm going to tell you why this is the best film I've seen so far in 2026, and it's not particularly close, guys. All right, just so you know where I'm coming from, this is one of the best horror films I've seen in years. And I say that as someone who considers a movie like Hereditary to be one of my favorites of all time. We are going to be doing a spoiler free review today, so I'm going to keep things broad for the most part. But I do want to talk about this film in a real way. I think I can do that without ruining it for you. Let's get into it. Obsession is written, directed, and edited, which I think is an interesting point I might bring up later, by Curry Barker. And before I tell you about the film itself, I just want you to remember his name, because after this movie, Barker's already been tapped to direct the new Texas Chainsaw Massacre reboot, which is for A24. So I think we're watching a filmmaker make his mark in this genre in real time, which is pretty cool. Now, as far as the movie goes, the premise is pretty clean, especially if you saw that trailer. Bear, played by Michael Johnson, is a young guy. He works at a guitar music shop. His childhood friend and co-worker Nikki, played by Inde Navarattee, we will talk about her plenty, don't worry, but she also works there with him, and we find out that Bear is completely infatuated with her. They've been close for years, but it's never gone beyond friendship on her end, and he can never quite get the words out to tell her how he feels. And then Bear gets his hands on something called a one-wish willow. Think about it kind of like a Ouija board is this little novelty, like supernatural toy. And the way this one works, if you break it in half and make a wish, then it supposedly will come true, but you only get one wish. There's no takebacks. Sitting outside of Nikki's house, he uses it and he makes the wish. Now, the phrasing of his wish, I think, is very important for what ends up happening the rest of the film, but he wishes that Nikki would love him more than anything else in the world. And then, as expected, that wish does come true. All right, and talking about this segment, I do want to be upfront with you. The first 20 to 30 minutes of this film are slow. They are literally a slow burn, the definition of it. I'm not going to try to sugarcoat that. So much so that when I was in the movie, in the theater with my wife, I was kind of like, is this any good? What's happening here? Like, this just seems like a kind of dark romance. Like, what's going on? There's no horror in that opening stretch. I mean, there's some foreboding score, and there's definitely atmosphere throughout the film, but nothing that was really justifying the Rotten Tomatoes score I'd seen, which I think was like 98% when I went to see it on Saturday. But here is what I figured out pretty quickly. By the time the film kicks into gear, that first act isn't filler. It is actually doing real work. Barker, in those first 30 minutes, he's basically building a genuine connection to really all the characters, but specifically Nikki. We see her give $20 to a homeless man, for example, outside of a bar. You see her playing kind of like a therapist for her friends, trying to hold everybody together. She's a writer, she has goals, she has a real path, and she genuinely just seems like a sweet and good person. I think that time that we spent with the real Nikki is essential because we see what happens to her later, but you need to have that version of her locked in your memory because when things go sideways, and they go fucking sideways, it hits much harder because you actually knew exactly who she was before any of this stuff started. Once that one wish willow does its thing, the movie you thought you were watching really does kind of become something else, but it still keeps that parent facade. And I do mean all of that in the best way. Nikki is now the one obsessed with Bear. She has to fulfill that wish, right? She has to love him more than anything else in the world. And that's not a metaphor in this case. It's absolute. It's consuming. It doesn't leave room for anything else. Like, she no longer has her goals. She's no longer a writer. It all gets swallowed up by this wish that Bear made on her behalf without her knowledge or consent. And here's where the film gets genuinely interesting, at least thematically, because the whole time I was really thinking the trailer is telling me the story. You see Nikki acting erratic, terrifying, dangerous. She's obviously the villain, right? She's a horror movie monster. I don't think that's right. I think Bear is actually the villain here. By the end of this film, he's gone from a sympathetic, lonely, relatable guy, someone that I was legitimately rooting for, to someone that I found repugnant because he stripped this woman of her free will. She was on a really promising path, living her life, becoming who she was going to be, right? But he derailed all of that because he didn't have just the courage to talk to her. He didn't even ask her out or tell her, how he felt and just let her respond like a human being. So the movie isn't really subtle about what it's saying, but it's also not preachy about it. I mean, the theme, really, in my opinion, is right there in the title, obsession, right? What does unchecked infatuation actually cost the person on the other side of it? Look, if I'm getting a pull quote onto the movie poster, which has never happened for me, it's going to be this, though, for this movie. Darkly hilarious and terrifying, because somehow Curry Barker is doing both of those things all at the same time, and it really worked for me. I mean, there are moments in this film where things are genuinely horrifying and disturbing, and I found myself laughing out loud in the theater, not because it was like cheap or unintentionally funny, but because the film is using dark comedy in this really precise way. Like, the absurdity of the situation brushes up against real dread, and it kind of creates this feeling where you don't quite know how to process what you're seeing. You know, for example, there's a scene in the film that might be one of my favorites where Bear calls customer service for One Wish Willow. A man answers, and I only found out later that that's actually the voice of Curry Barker, the filmmaker. But anyway, he's completely deadpan. He's like half asleep, sounds like a stoner. He just says hello when he answers the phone, like unbothered that someone is calling about this supernatural toy that possibly ruined their life. He doesn't seem to know even what the Wish Willow does, right? He's just a guy answering the phone, kind of irritable, but it's genuinely one of the funniest things I've seen in a while. And then that same scene takes a chilling turn, because Bear at the end of the call is told that if he wants to, he can talk to the real Nikki. And we hear her screaming for help in the background. It's just like screaming in pain or in fear over and over again, and Bear just hangs up the phone. That's the movie kind of in a nutshell. It's funny, but then there's a gut punch, and that just happens over and over again. All right, I have to stop and talk about the lead performance, Inde Navarattee. She's 25 years old. Most people probably know her from Superman and Lois, which I actually have never seen. But after Obsession, I genuinely believe that she belongs in the conversation for the best horror lead performance in recent memory. And upon a rewatch, I'm considering adding her to my all-timer list. Like, I really think when it comes to central female performances, she would be up there with like Linda Blair from The Exorcist, Sissy Spacek from Carrie. I've already mentioned Hereditary, but this is the best that I've seen since like Toni Collette in that film or Lupita Nyong'o in Jordan Peele's Us. It's truly phenomenal. What Navarattee is doing in this movie is extraordinarily difficult because she's playing two different versions of the same person, but it's more than that. She's that real Nikki from the first act, right? And then she's Freaky Nikki, which is what I'm going to call it, which is after the Wish Willow does his thing. And that's actually derived from a nickname within the movie itself, but I won't get into that to not spoil anything. But these two, like, really different personalities, it never really tips into camp or going over the top. She's erratic, unhinged. She does things to her body and her face in this role that are truly unsettling. But underneath all of it, you can still feel that real Nikki kind of trapped in there, trying to escape. There's a moment, and I'm not going to say a whole lot, but we hear the real Nikki speak after the Wish Willow incident. Briefly, she's kind of like whispering, asking for help. What she says is devastating. And the fact that Bear hears it and his reaction or kind of anti-reaction to it really kind of morphs my feeling of him as a character for the rest of the film. Quick shout out when it comes to casting to Michael Johnston, who played Bear, because this is a really difficult arc. I mean, you've heard what I've been saying about him, but he was like a relatable, sympathetic, I feel bad for this dude, and then, you know, an hour later I hate him and want him to die. So that's not easy to do. Also, I love seeing Andy Richter is in this movie, which was Conan O'Brien's sidekick on the late night Conan O'Brien show for years, and he was just here kind of out of nowhere. He plays one of the music employees' father and runs the music store, and I was just like, he only has like 4 or 5 lines in the movie. I don't even know why he's in there. Maybe he's friends with Barker, but it was really, really inspired, and I love seeing him there. So, in wrapping up, I want to place this film in context because I think it deserves that. Obsession was made for under $1 million, and it took less than a month to shoot. And knowing that, I would put it alongside a lot of the modern horror films that I've loved in the last few years. I mentioned Hereditary, right? Midsummer, Companion with Sophie Thatcher I loved. Together with Alison Brie and Dave Franco last year. The Ugly Stepsister, you guys know I loved that one last year. All these movies are about grief, codependency, obsession, control, right? But they wrap those ideas, and this one does too, into the like crowd-friendly horror film. and it works on a pure genre level also. And every movie I just mentioned, including The Ugly Stepsister, which was my #1 of 2025, I think I would probably put Obsession, at least on my first watch, above all of those. It's a spoiler-free review, so I can't really get into it. I got to keep it light, but there's some things that are like deliberately ambiguous in the movie. And I think that's the right call, to be honest. You know, really about the Wish Willow itself. I had to actually read up on my end because I'm like, was this a toy in like the 70s or 80s? Because it kind of sounds like something that did exist. Hit Google. It's a cool little rabbit hole that you'll be in. But Barker, you know, he gives you enough to think about without spelling it out, which is exactly the right call. And usually these Blumhouse movies miss that mark. I think it's really dealing with your inner demons, whatever character you want to focus in on for that. It's about what happens when you don't address any kind of obsession that you may have in a healthy, productive way. It's about free will, what it means to take that from someone else, and especially someone that you claim to love. It starts slow, but it really haunted me by the end, and I do mean that as a compliment. Obsession is playing in theaters right now, like I said, from Focus and Blumhouse. Go see it. If you love horror, this is literally required. It is shot in like a 4:3 ratio, which was very R-torture to me too, and it might be a little eyebrow or seem a little pretentious to some people, but it kind of made sense with the concept of this movie. You know, think of a filmmaker like Ari Aster, who I mentioned a couple times already, or Robert Eggers. You know, they really like to do experimental things with the filmmaking itself, along with, you know, the juiciness of the story, which this was also written by Barker. I have really high hopes for him as a filmmaker. The lighting is also extremely dim and dark, shadows everywhere on purpose because of the themes of the film. So I would say see it in the theater, but it's not like you have to. And then if you're somebody who usually finds the horror genre like too shallow or too cheap or like predictable, running up the stairs when you should be going out the front door, to quote Scream, you know, this film might actually change your mind about that, because there are a lot of those tropes built into it, but it's smart, brutal, funny in the darkest way, and it's got one of the best lead performances I've seen in a horror movie literally in my lifetime, and I'm 50. And like I said, Barker is a filmmaker to watch for sure. Inde Navarattee is a star. Girl, bye. You killed it in this. I am telling you right now, all of my Oscar heads, all of my regulars channel members, anybody that watches my videos on a regular basis, make some GD noise for Inde Navarattee. She is going in my fucking lead actress predictions. She is. You know, man, she just absolutely blew me away in this. And I think I've made that clear. She will be in my Oscars predictions post haste. Stay tuned. All right, last thing to do is just to give you the score for Obsession. I might come back and do a little 5 or 10 minute spoiler discussion on this movie and tag it as such to make sure that you guys know you're getting spoiled. But this one being spoiler free, I couldn't talk about everything, but there's some gnarly shit in this movie, especially if you love body horror and really psychological horror too. So stick around if I decide to do that. If this actually ends up being my favorite movie of the year, I probably will do that. But for right now, this spoiler free, all I can tell you is this movie is fucking perfect for me. Absolutely a gifted runtime, barely over 90 minutes. Once that first half hour goes by, it was nonstop joy. My eyeballs were wide open, occasionally cringing, occasionally laughing, but enjoying the hell out of myself the whole time. So I'm going to be true to that in my rating of the film. It's probably closer to a 9.5, but I don't do 9.5s. So I'm going to throw this son of a bitch a 10. If for no other reason, because Inde Navarattee earned it. And without her in this movie committing that much to that role, it probably would be closer to like a 7 based on the concept and the themes. But the direction of Barker and the performance from her easily rise this to a top tier film, especially in the horror genre. Let me know down below. Did you see Obsession this past weekend? Are you planning on seeing it? Does this intrigue you? Did you see it, and is my score way off? Let me know all that down below. Don't forget to subscribe if you would not mind, especially if you love award season. I will be out here next time talking about the Cannes Film Festival. I'll give you guys a little wrap up about midweek this week of everything I've seen out there in terms of reviews and what I think is still in the race. Stick around for that and much, much more. I will see you soon in the garage.